a large set of producers, employers, but discussed very little. We talk about the practice of accommodating workers within production units, and we have discussions about worksite housing, but the kind of arrangement that we are talking about today is perhaps even it will not even fall within that kind of discourse, because this is accommodating workers within the factory floors. I think the precarity is very high, and it talks about different kind of a vulnerability that informal casual workers in India encounter on a daily basis. So we thought we should explore that phenomenon and the factors that contribute to that kind of phenomenon to come into being, and how the employers and the workers really look at it. What are the various sort of lens one could use in terms of explaining that kind of arrangements, etc. The study was, now, and we know that Ahmedabad, and the site of study was Ahmedabad. Shubham will talk about it in greater detail. Two kind of industrial hubs of Ahmedabad. We know that Ahmedabad was once known as the Manchester of India, and right now the media variously kind of celebrate it as the epicenter of future growth and the emerging production hub and whatnot. So I think Ahmedabad is definitely one of the cities which is really gaining a lot of importance as a site where which can also attract a large number of migrant workers. At least the estimates say that about 1.3 million migrant workers are in the city. So within this kind of a setting, we have looked at the phenomenon of in-factory worker accommodation, and the presentation is going to be made by Shubham Kaushal. Shubham undertook the field research for this study when he was a researcher associated with Aajeevika Bureau. Subsequently, he went to SOAS to do his master's in development studies, and he continues his association with labor rights movements and organizations. So he's going to make the presentation of the findings. But we are especially fortunate in having a very, very wonderful, distinguished set of researchers to be with us today. Professor Lerche, Professor Amita Bhide, and Professor Renu Desai. And they collectively have contributed significantly to discourses on inclusive urbanization and urban transformation, rural-urban migration, and labor processes and movements, and migration in particular. Professor Lerche is currently an Emeritus Professor in Agricultural and Labor Studies in the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. His work, along with other scholars, on rural labor relations, informalization of work, and the structural determinants of labor discrimination, has made a substantive contribution to our understanding of labor processes and relations in India and South Asia in general. Professor Bhide has long been a researcher and teacher. She has been working she has been really using her research to influence field practices and policies in issues like inclusive urban development, local governance, and access to basic amenities in Indian cities. Professor Renu Desai is a closer friend of Aajeevika Bureau. She works very closely with us on several initiatives, and she also has her scholarship spans a range of areas: urban redevelopment, slum resettlement, water sanitation, access, housing, especially. And as I told you, she has been a very close associate of Aajeevika Bureau for several years now. I must also welcome all those who have taken the time out to be with us this afternoon. And I hope that you would enrich the discussion by asking questions and sharing your comments and feedback on what we are doing. And the webinar will follow this kind of a pattern. We would request Shubham Kaushal to make the presentation for about 25 minutes. Following that, we would request the kind of panelists to kind of put forward their ideas. And then we'll open up the kind of floor for open discussions, questions, comments, etc. And then kind of Shubham and the discussants can respond to some of those questions which they find important, and then we will wind up the session. So without losing much time, let me request Shubham to make his presentation.
Thank you, Zara ma'am, for the introduction. Can I ask Anurag to share? Yeah. Yeah, we can move to the next slide. So, as Tara ma'am gave an introduction to the phenomena that we are particularly referring to here, which is worksite living. We've seen that it's prevalent in various sectors, in construction, domestic work, hotels and restaurants, but it's also emerging as a practice in what are the modern day factories. These factories are usually small-sized factories that undertake specialized tasks in highly competitive and unequal bargaining positions in the market. They are clustered around larger factories or in urban zones that are often considered illegal under land planning norms. These are also factories that largely operate as unregistered units under labor laws. And some scholars have argued that this is a feature of contemporary informalized manufacturing in India. What we are seeing here is how they are functioning as a place of work as well as living for workers who work in it. So this particular living arrangement, which is observed in informalized factories, illustrates a particular kind of work residence system that aims to expand control beyond regulated work time, as well as the workplace, thus accelerating surplus extraction. More recently, this setup of living inside factory premises has internationally attracted significant attention as dormitory labor regime, where the scholars over there studied China's Foxconn and Apple factories. They argued there that the presence of dormitories inside factory premises enabled integration of work and non-work lives in a way that facilitated absolute control over the labor. So the result would be to produce a very disciplined, cheap, and ever-available workforce, which is also made possible by the short-term employment cycles of rural migrants, restrictive state policy on permanent urban migration. So Goodburn and Mishra have also argued that such structural similarities as well as local adaptations of this system also exist elsewhere, especially wherever migrant labor is employed. So, for example, in India, we've also seen in worker hostels and in other sectors, But in India, fewer inquiries exist of how such a accommodation is used as a labor strategy, especially in case of modern day factories that we're referring to here. It seems that, whenever industrial accidents happen, only then this pervasive practice comes to light. We often hear that victims are workers who've been living on site. But this has been studied in other informal sectors, especially in construction, where migrant laborers are employed. The studies have especially highlighted the linkage of this practice with recruitment and the centrality of contractors in making this arrangement possible. So here, the key argument of this paper, what we've done in this paper over here is to look at living arrangements for migrants as an outcome of the informalized industry with uneven state regulation, and also the caste and kinship-based migration process. So we are arguing here that worksite living represents a very distinct format of urban employment, where firms have greater control over workers' lives and determine their relations with the city. Next slide. So, where is this to talk a bit more about, the location where this study takes place? So, Narol and Vatva are two regions that are located in the southern periphery of Ahmedabad. As we know, Ahmedabad is, among the largest cities in India. So, Vatva is an area that's largely developed by the GIDC, which is the Industrial Corporation, especially for MSMEs, whereas Narol is more of a classic example of a peri-urban area. So within both these regions, there are thousands of small and medium-sized factories with a handful of, say, large factories. And all of these specialize in various tasks along the supply chain, particularly textile and garment chain. Work here is mostly precarious. It's characterized by hazardous work as well. And it's predominantly run by migrant workers. A lot of them are from Rajasthan, UP, Bihar, MP, Jharkhand, as well as surrounding rural areas. So the method here that we relied on is largely narratives and case studies. As Tara ma'am was mentioning earlier, a lot of the qualitative data collection techniques that we used here took place at the time when I was serving at Aajeevika between 20 to 22. And very importantly, this is a constant process of collaborating and participating, that allows the knowledge generation itself to shape up. Next slide, please. So just to give an idea of the area that we're talking about here, it's Narol and Vatva is sort of located within these two highways that you can see that are highlighted in yellow. There are a lot of large factories here, a lot of farmlands, villages mixed in, and a lot of informal settlements as well. Next. So our approach over here was to understand on various axes why is this practice so pervasive in this particular setup. So the first thing was to understand what is the workers' logic behind this. What is the link between the living arrangement at the work site and the recruitment at the source? How does it impact wages? How does it impact workers' safety? What happens to separation of work and living? How does it affect daily reproductive tasks, as well as to taking care of the next generation? And what's the role of the state in this? What is the role of regulatory bodies? Next. So we found distinctions primarily along these three occupational categories: boiler operators, boiler work, denim finishing work, which is undertaken in garment processing factories, and stitching work, which is separately undertaken in stitching units. So to talk about boiler work, what I refer to here is most of these textile and garment factories have boilers within them, and these boilers have to operate continuously to generate steam power that runs the factory. This work is very hazardous in nature because it involves loading of fuel wood directly into boiler chambers. The process is called firing, and as well as helpers carrying very heavy loads on their heads. So here we see that usually it's a short duration migration cycle, and workers are hired as a couple, and they migrate as a gang against wage advances. So the women over here, they do not often consider themselves as workers, but they often consider themselves as accompanying their husbands. And also they bear the entire brunt of lack of basic facilities over here. There are also, as I mentioned, there are also wage advances. So this particular migration process is debt entangled, and there are no periodic payments over here. The payments extended over here are need-based, based on daily subsistence requirements towards ration. So in a sense, workers in this particular occupation are bound to that particular workplace for the duration of the employment cycle. And with respect to finishing work over here, there's a lot of denim finishing work that happens, particularly in this cluster. So denim is provided by the buyers. Over here, often the work is runs on very short deadlines, piece rate calculation of wages. Their working hours are prolonged, and there's no contract or social security. And this work is often performed by long distance male migrants, overrepresented by Dalit communities. When we talk about stitching work, next slide. Again, here, this is primarily buyer provided. The garments, the buttons are provided by the buyers, but the equipment and thread is that of the stitching unit owners. This work is also very last minute, target driven work. There's a lot of pressure of short deadlines. Working hours are erratic. There's no social security, and they are paid in piece rates. Again, this is predominantly has long distance male migrants from Dalit communities. So what did we find here with respect to what does the living arrangement look like? So firstly, with respect to boiler workers often live right adjacent to the boiler. It's a hutment, more or less, with no basic facilities. Water is sometimes provided by the contractor. And because of this, women are particularly affected. Boiler work is the kind of occupation where where couples migrate together. So often their children also come along. So women are under the double burden of not only working in the lack of facilities, but they also have to deal with smoke from hearth and other health issues that may arise because of lack of facilities. And also, the provision of this hutment, the provision of this living is often subject to rent deduction also as well. When it comes to garment processing, often the living facilities are subject to whatever is available in the factory. We often find that workers are sleeping on the floor. They occupy the areas between machines or outside in the open if the factory has open areas. Similarly with stitching as well. So stitching units are very small units. They're basically like small shops. So workers have to find space between machines to rest, to sleep. And again, basic facilities are subject to whatever is provided by the employers. So what we have to understand here is that employers are not interested in investing to make the living better. But still this is projected as an additional facility for workers. So if we move, So this is a depiction of the living arrangement for boiler workers. So you can see in the background, that's the factory where they work. In the middle, you can see a lot of makeshift enclosures. One of them right in the middle is a enclosure for bathing. And in the foreground, you can see the fuel wood that is used, that has been discarded by the factory to be used by workers for their cooking. So what do we also make of these living arrangements? First, there's no separate space for working and living for a lot of the workers who are within this. We also found some distinctions between who lives where in the factory based on their caste and ethno-linguistic background. So say in one factory where Adivasi migrant family is running the boiler, they would only reside adjacent to the boiler, whereas other migrants, depending on their linguistic grouping, were free to find spaces elsewhere. So what we found is that occupational demarcations also extend into living, as well as for the entire duration of their migration or their work cycle. Yes, next. So what we have to understand is that from the workers' perspective, they do not see living as separate from work. For them, living or if we might, say house or home, home and belonging mostly are in the rural. There is no so also they describe this work as something that is considered safe, especially for boiler workers. They see the certainty of work availability as something that keeps them safe through that employment duration. Uh, Also, workers describe that a lot of these practices are preferred because of this. This also arises in response to falling wages or at least stagnant wages. So this becomes a way for them to maximize their earnings, save on rent. We also have to understand the context that there is discrimination outside in the city based on caste, language, from locals as well as landlords. For some workers, this might also be part of their employment modality. Say, for instance, for boiler workers who have to continuously run and maintain boilers, they are required to stay on site. And also, this works for employers because employers are also constantly in need of workers to be readily available so that they can meet their short deadlines. And then we observe that in garment stitching, a lot of times employers would also allow their workers to retain the dwelling space while taking up work at other units during lean periods, uh, which is a strategy to also not pay during the lean period, but also be able to put moral pressure during busy periods. So the focus of employers is on continuous availability of labor, through the market and migration cycles. So what are the implications for this? Firstly, we see that there are wages are suboptimal. So being paid on piece rate means that piece rate itself controls the worker. There's no physical supervision even required of the employer even required over there. There's hardly any time left for rest and recovery for the worker. They're squeezed for their daily reproductive time. Women often wake up much earlier to make up for the lack of facilities and look after their children. And importantly, when workers are injured, they cannot work during that time, and so they're not paid for that period. They have to rely on their rural households to perform these tasks of recovery from injury and illnesses for them. So workers also experience isolation from the city and from other workers because, as I described, there is a lot of segregation prevalent. Some members of the family do not even see themselves as workers. These distinctions are visible along the lines of occupation and identity as to who is more isolated. For workers, this also appears normalized because contractors and employers are often related as kin. So that conventional nature of employer and worker does not stay the same here. Workers have to maintain a good long-term relation with the employer or contractor for work availability, for payment of wages, and also for cash advances or meeting other emergencies. Because we have to remember that as migrants, there is no social security for them, which might otherwise be available. So because of this over-reliance on employers or contractors as safety net, this greatly limits workers' ability to demand or negotiate better conditions. Workers describe how they have to make polite requests to even get timely payments. Also, so they do not necessarily view the employer or the contractor as capable of fulfilling their demands because they can perceive the survivalist and weak position of their employer or their contractor in this very highly competitive, informalized, and oppressive market where there's no regulatory or supervisory oversight as well. So that means that whether or not the worker will continue to exist or live in the city is completely subject to their employment. So what are the OSH risks, occupational health and safety risks that workers endure? So firstly, workers who live on site are most likely victims of industrial accidents. Also, their exposure to risk is doubled as workers who live on site. Substances that they work with seep into their food as well as living. Work is hazardous in nature for a lot of them. and also intensive for a lot of others. So injuries, finger injuries, burns, respiratory illnesses, body pains, fatigue, these are all routine and common issues. Uh, Safety is entirely considered the responsibility of the worker, especially for these routine injuries. And there's a normalization of this, especially with the understanding that risk taking is a part of the job. And this is also because risk of injury is always measured against the loss of wages and work. So another issue is the impact of excessive indoor heat, something that also remains highly underreported. Then we consider the state's role in this. So on-site living is often overlooked by factories and boilers inspectors. Whenever there are any inspections, they do not consider this as something within their purview. Urban authorities are also of a similar view. They consider these areas where factories are located as industrial areas and not within their purview. They consider it as responsibility of the labor department or the contractor who brings the migrant workers as seen from their perspective. And again, we also see that labor laws are often implemented in response to industrial actions, and they're and they are perceived to be punitive in nature. They're only used for that purpose, and they do not come up as assistive in nature. As I was mentioning earlier, legal regulation and policy addressing this category of factories has largely remained absent and inadequate at best. Because of the small size of the factories, because of the uneven application of laws in these areas, as often even the clusters where these factories are present are considered illegal. So when we look at the new labor codes, they also continue this applicability through number of workers that excludes smaller units. Again, they do not address the implementation issues where regulation and where registration is weak. Also, the new laws do not contain very adequate, sufficient provisions with respect to the living conditions, because living has to be seen as a whole and not cherry-picked in relation to just availability of facilities. Migrant settlements are also excluded from housing policies due to a variety of city-based residential and document-centric selection criteria. So to conclude, again, going back to what was introduced in the beginning of the presentation, one is we have to understand that this study lends evidence to how it accelerates surplus extraction by controlling the reproductive lives of workers. We have seen that there is increased work intensity, there's extension of workday, wages are below what the value is generated, as well as workers are deprived of the cost of renewal itself. Rest and recovery from injury is completely transferred and externalized to the worker and the rural household. So we need to understand that these issues and needs with living in the city also vary based on the occupation and social identity of the worker. So what we saw in the description of the living arrangements is that the degree of the freedom of mobility greatly varies. And it's a hybrid form of freedom that workers experience, which is embedded within social relations. So when we look at boiler workers, say, for instance, their working and living modalities debt entangled. So they are bound to their work site, but they also view this as a safe setup since work is available to them for a certain duration. And also the wage advances that they get fulfill their social needs at source. For garment stitching workers, they are often able to move between units to maximize their earnings, to avoid idling time. And with stitching and processing workers, they're they're also able to attain better wages only by changing employers. So for them, this particular modality does not have long-lasting relations with the employers, unlike with boiler workers. And when we think of the relation with the city, so the boiler gang is almost absolutely disconnected from the city. They are completely dependent on the contractor for all of their supplies, for recruitment, for work, for wages. So what happens is that Worksite Living ensures that workers from particular marginalized communities remain in certain particular niches of the labor market through these multiple interlinked modalities. What we also need to, I think, take away from this is that the rhythmic complexity of migration that just looking at these three occupation presents to us also suggests that the demarcation of migration itself as permanent, semi-permanent, short-term, or seasonal is difficult to sustain when we see it from the worker's perspective. So when we think about boiler workers, even though their employment duration might last for 2 to 6 months, but they would continue to come back to the same place. Then again, something to take away is that in response to sedentary bias in policy, we often attempt to see the workers' logics, and fit their claims into linear accounts. But we also need to think from multi-local perspectives, multi-local living and livelihoods to understand and address their issues. With that, I will stop here. And back to Tara, ma'am. Ma'am, you're on mute.
Thanks a lot, Shubham. Thank you so much. I think we should now kind of turn to our discussants, and may I request Professor Lerche to sort of give his comments on the paper and then present his views on this.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here, to see many faces I know already, and of course in particular to have the opportunity to comment on the paper by you, Tara, and you, Shubham. Well, I'm very pleased to get this opportunity. I'll start by congratulating the authors. This is an excellent piece. It's in fact, maybe I should congratulate more than the authors, because it is the latest of a number of very fine publications on informalized migrant labor in Gujarat, and we've had a few others before. We've had Jain and Sharma, we've had Jairam and Varma, we've had Desai. So great publications are coming out of Gujarat, and it's of course not sort of out of Gujarat. It is out of people working very close with what goes on in the fields. It's not easy to do this kind of research that underlies this piece or the other pieces. It requires long-term, in-depth engagement, and it's really only been possible, I think, because the authors of these various pieces have been working with organizations such as Aajeevika Bureau and also with the prior CLRA in Ahmedabad, and that's really great to see. All these pieces have something in common. They all show that they have a good understanding of what is modern capitalism like. They have a good understanding of how social discrimination is part and parcel of labor relations, and how Dalits and Adivasis are always in the worst jobs. And they have an understanding of how it pans out in different sectors. And they have this detailed insight, information that makes it plausible what they argue, that can sustain their argument. And I think this has actually helped bringing up that kind of labor discrimination, that to bring it higher up the agenda, way beyond of their own work. So congratulations. To zoom in on this article is important for a number of reasons. And it has all the things that I just said before about the whole group of articles here. But this article, I think, is particularly important because within all these nuances, all these understandings of connections, and all these analytical threads, it focuses in on on-site living and shows how significant aspect this is in the oppression of labor and how it adds to the extreme control of labor that exists and how it creates docile, malleable labor that is always ready to work. And this is quite a significant takeaway because it means that when we think about labor relations, we should not just think about in-work relations. We also have to involve how labor is being reproduced outside of work, even if it is inside the factory. And a part of that, not the least housing. There are other aspects too, but not the least housing. And I don't think that has been highlighted so strongly in relation to factory work before in India. There's the dormitory regime literature. There's the on-site housing in brick kilns, etc. But on-site housing within factory work is much less focused on. So just to bring this up in the manner that it's done here and analyzed is an achievement. It's of course also a very nuanced analysis. I mean, and one thing that's maybe worth just pointing out is the difference that exists, and the article does this, between on-site housing, rented rooms, and hostels. And also to point out that this is not a black and white situation. It's not that the one is good, the other is bad. Of course, there are degrees of oppression involved here. But even if we're looking at rented rooms, for example, there's enough evidence from Manesar, from around Pune, that when workers that work as informalized labor in factories rent rooms, they still have to suffer from room owners that are in cahoots with the factories, with spies that report on them, etc., etc. So it's not the one is freedom, the other is unfreedom. What we're looking at here is clearly worse than in that sense than room renting, but it is not these extreme opposites, and the paper doesn't suggest that either, but it's maybe worth just pointing out. Now, I think Shubham gave a good overview of the details of the article. So let me move on to sort of what I like about its analytical, the analysis, how it works there. And one thing I think is important is that it shows that this extreme on-site housing control we're talking about here, the big question is, how can this be possible? I mean, how is this acceptable? Now, and I think it shows that one can only understand that by looking at reasons as a cocktail of reasons. There's the general discrimination of Adivasis. There's the debt bondage, some people will call it, on freedom that some people suffer for, and that in a sense on-site housing is just one more aspect of that adds to this bundle of extreme conditions. And the paper goes beyond that. It shows that the worst conditions one can only really understand by looking at the workers. That it is to understand how this kind of relations are steeped in what goes on in home villages, in the long-term oppressive social relations in home villages that can be continued in the factories, that it is that say Adivasis, not all Adivasis end up in this situation. Some Adivasis will migrate to South India and work in factories where conditions are better. Some do not. Why is it so? Well, that we can only understand if we look into what are the conditions of the specific laborers, Adivasis, that end up in these conditions. What drives them? We can look at it as they prefer this to some extent, and that is true, but we need maybe to understand the structural relation. What is it that makes them prefer this? What is it that, why haven't they got other options that other workers have, also other workers of that broad background of being Adivasis? And so that is what I mean by when I say this is a cocktail of reasons. But there's maybe one, and there are reasons that goes beyond what goes on within the particular sector, but that relates to how workers of these how these particular workers experience their opportunities, their structural conditions, that matters. Now, the paper throws up so many different issues, and I mean, one could discuss freedom on freedom, and I'm very pleased that the paper does not see this as a core issue. That it is an issue, but it's, one cannot use that to analyze everything. One must start with how the labor relation is, in the sense degrees of freedom follows from that. I would maybe go even further and say, analytically, it might make sense to start more directly from labor regimes under capitalism today than the paper does. By that I mean that one needs to understand why, in the present context in India, is it that in certain sectors this is how employers are able to and want to organize exploitation, and why is it that workers have to accept these conditions here, and why do they think that even aspects of that is useful for them. Now, and I think that the paper does that in many ways, but it might be useful to bring it more to the fore. Now, capitalism across the world makes use of all sorts of oppressive mechanisms. Racial capitalism is a concept. How ethnicity is used to oppress workers is a concept, but it is also the case. So there are certain general structures one can look at, but it is also the case that labor conditions differ within different sectors and within different countries. Certainly, the emergence of modern labor relations is not a given anymore. We need to understand how capitalism today makes use of forms and ways of extracting surplus and oppressing people that we maybe considered archaic before, and why this is more the case in certain sectors than others. In India, for example, while of course 92% of workers are informalized in one way or another, there's a difference between working for Amazon or for the automotive industry and what we're looking at here, the garment sector we're looking at here. I'm not saying it is a pleasure to work for Amazon. I'm aware of the strikes, etc. But but you are earning more and your daily conditions are better than what we're looking at here. And why is it that certain sectors are able to and are willing to and maybe see it necessary to oppress workers in this particular way? I think that goes beyond, while it's a good point to argue that boilers need to be running 24 hours, there are ways of dealing with that. This is one way. What is it that enables this particular way? Now, to me, if one were to take this further, one would have to understand what are the particular aspects that enables this kind, or maybe necessitates this kind of exploitation. Is it something about it being in Gujarat and therefore being possible, for example? Is it the sector? One would also have to understand, why are the workers why do the workers accept this? What brings them here when they could go elsewhere? Why these workers here? And of course, one would need to understand how oppression is organized. And I think this paper does a bit of all these things. But of course, the main thing it does is the focus on on-site housing. And I really like the paper in the way it maintains a broad framework, tracks things in, and then has a strong focus. One cannot do everything in one paper. To me, it's worth thinking wider. It's worth trying to figure out how to understand and the different tendencies. But in the end, one has to have a focus on, and this paper, with this focus, brings another aspect that we need to understand in order to understand how labor oppression, labor control within in certain parts of the informalized labor, within certain part of the informalized manufacturing is organized. It brings that to the fore. And I can see that both as academically extremely important, but of course also as extremely important for further activism, because it's great for activism to have a strong focus on a particular thing. And if this could take that further, certainly the paper will have served not only the academic purpose, but also a very important political purpose. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for that really encouraging and very sort of detailed sort of set of comments. I think, as you said, if I can take a couple of minutes, I think it's extremely important to address the question that you raised. What exactly traps these workers in these kinds of, kind of employment or living sort of patterns? I can see a kind of a connection with your work on structural determinants of rural. So I think in some sense, in subsequently we can perhaps take it to the sources from where the workers coming. And I think it essentially links there. The Adivasi workers from the south of Gujarat and the kind of social institutional rigidities within which that society has been sort of made to survive. And make their livelihoods in those parts, the vulnerability and precarity that they face as as within their kind of villages there. I think we have been able to see those connections definitely when we were writing it, but then the focus was on the destination. I think in our language, it is a destination place where the workers really work. But I think I completely we are extremely happy that you had a kind of a good reading of the paper and you have given us great comments. I think this definitely perhaps encourage Shubham or any of us to continue with some of the inquiries in future. Thank you so much. I will now turn to Professor Bhide. I think if you can kind of give us your comments, ma'am, it would be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tara, and the opportunity to also be here and to read such a wonderful paper. Okay, so I will not reiterate those comments as to, I see the paper really as a very, very interesting provocation. I'm audible, Tara?
Yes,
yeah.
you are, isn't it?
Yeah. So I really see this paper as a very important provocation from multiple points of view. And the first, I think, let me go to the title of the paper itself, where the opening part of the title is about industrial fragmentation. Right? Now, I think even within the paper, the reference to Michael Barawai and others who are talking about the breakdown of industry. Whereas I think it's very interesting to see this denim production or jeans production as an industry which has hardly been organized in India itself. So how, like barely, I think 20% to 30% of the overall denim production in India takes place in the formal sector. And most of it is in this kind of a informalized form. So how does one look at these global linkages? And I think, therefore, to even treat this question, and I'm not talking of the paper itself. As I said, to me, this paper is a provocation, really, to think about these conditions of labor as also being linked to the overall chains of production, consumption, as are happening in the contemporary world today, is very, very, very critical. Uh, uh, what is it that makes so many producers of these to be in a place where the workers themselves are saying the employers ki majburi hai? Okay. What makes the site of production to be in places which are so liminal in their stature that they are neither the urban or the rural. They are situated on the periphery of the urban. They are situated in places which are themselves informal, and therefore, in some ways, creating a space where laws do not really apply, right? So this happens both in terms of the administrative jurisdictions within which places like Vatwa, Narol are created, and several other cities in India itself, one can name, which are happening, where production is happening in this fashion. So there almost seems to be a deliberation and a link between particular kinds of places, particular kinds of production regimes, particular kind of labor regimes. And I think the paper really hints at the confluence of all of these three. And I think that's a very, very important contribution of the paper, which needs to be perhaps also taken further. The second aspect of it, which I thought was very, very interesting, was really this thing of the entire continuum between freedoms and unfreedoms, agency to complete lack of agency, employer control to employer benefaction, state negligence to what should one say? I think one is not really seeing state benefaction here in the paper in any way. But I to the state turning an active role to perhaps the state turning a complete blind eye, right? And I think a lot of these continuums within which this kind of a condition of labor is produced and reproduced all over again. So I think it is not just a paper on worksite housing, but it is a paper both which alludes to and describes in extremely powerful and potent terms both the conditions of working as well as life. And I think that's a very, very important connection that the paper makes. It also therefore then raises several questions as to what are the ways out. Right? Because if there is a worker agency or worker choice albeit under all kinds of structural constraints, where there are laborers who are either choosing to offset all kinds of costs and therefore live amidst the boiler spaces or amidst the stitching machines. Okay, how does one look at decent housing? How does one look at decent work? How does one look at decent environment? In some ways, it also points out to the limitations in which researchers, activists, and laws and government have looked at some of these issues actually in silos. Silos because, for example, unions and international organizations like ILO only look at all of these issues through the lens of decent work. Okay? But that decent work also involves some element of decent living, and therefore, when people and laborers are choosing, in some ways, choosing exploitative conditions of living and labor as a way to perhaps secure some other things, okay? Equally horrible choices, perhaps. I mean, because I do not see that these choices are between something which is desirable and something which is less desirable. They are all equally, in some ways, horrible choices. But at the same time, it compels us to look at these connections in a much more meaningful manner. And I think our laws do this, our schemes do this, our research does this, and activists do this. And I think, therefore, to me, that is a very, very important area that one needs to perhaps focus one's effort on. How does one find a way out? To me, perhaps the path that this paper suggests is a far more complex one, right? It tells me in some ways, or it gives us the insight that community perhaps has a far more enduring influence on the kinds of life-labor relationships that we are talking about than perhaps previously imagined. That we will need to think about how different identities figure into the entire aspects of life and labor in both rural and the urban terms. And therefore, how does one organize, mobilize, and how does one pay people along in order to perhaps also make recent changes? Perhaps also it means that things about improvement may be much more negotiated than thinking about in a normative way. For example, are we looking at housing with improved agency or better housing with agency as a kind of secondary position? Are we looking at explicit entitlements? Are we looking at contracts? Are we looking at the way in which housing is included within how minimum wages are constructed? So there are many, many, many questions perhaps that the paper really raises for me. I'll stop.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for a close reading of the paper. And I think some of these kind of insights have been extremely, they will be very useful for, like as you very correctly said, containing this institution into any kind of framework was extremely difficult. Because it was really, it had a, as you really unlayer the way in which maybe Shubham's fieldwork kind of unfolded some of those complexities, it was extremely difficult to take it to in one direction. Or when you start unlayering the complexities, it became very clear to us that maybe we had a long policy section, I remember, in the first draft, and we thought that no, it's actually not really taking us anywhere because we can only ask questions on these things. And as you said, this the very location of these workers the nature of their production and the location of that production, the continuums that you talked about, from, like something from perhaps a control to benefaction, or from freedom to unfreedom. I think we really discuss some of these, the highly slippery terrains that one has to really traverse to find some meaning to the field realities and things like that. So very rightly you have pointed out that. And what is the way out is again a point where a lot of action and the practice of Aajeevika Bureau is located very deeply there. What is possible, like some of those mainstream solutions, or some perhaps very innovative kind of solutions in terms of working with a set of workers who think that their subjugation is natural and it's very normalized. And then how do you kind of devise ways of working with those workers, etc. So I think as you said, this also is a highly provocative sort of an exercise for an action organization to carry forward its set of activities in that particular sort of a region. I hope that's exactly what we would be sort of trying to kind of work with. Thanks so much. With that, I will now turn to Professor Renu Desai for her sort of comments here. Professor Renu,
you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Sorry. So, okay. Once again, thanks so much, Tara. I actually started by saying that I just wanted to clarify that I'm not a professor by any means. I haven't been teaching now for a good 4 or 5 years, but of course I do remain involved in research. And in fact, as you mentioned when you introduced me at the start, is that I have had a relationship with Aajeevika for some years now, and that relationship has only become closer over the last 1 year, as Aajeevika has decided to incubate a new, a housing company that would kind of take on this extremely challenging task of seeing, what kind of housing solutions can we actually bring to the table. So really, for the first time in my life, I mean, I've engaged with, civil society organizations since many years, especially on questions of eviction and resettlement. But nonetheless, it was still from a very much a research perspective, and now kind of really getting into the domain of housing practice, it just brings up a whole set of questions which are actually very, I think, extremely challenging, and one doesn't know what the answers are yet. And I think it is only through the practice, perhaps, that we will learn, and various things will unfold, and we will have to see, what kind of possibilities emerge, what is realized through them in terms of improving housing, but also the very important question that this paper raises, and which Amita alluded to, is that ultimately, we cannot de-link housing from the terms of employment that we see today in our cities and peri-urban areas, including even gram panchayat areas, which have gotten kind of industrialized. And we see these kind of, from big factories to small workshops. In the manufacturing sector, we see construction sites. Aajeevika has done, also research, and has been working with workers who also are in other sectors, like, small hotels, restaurants. So there's such a diverse range of sectors, and the kind of nature of employment, relationship between employer and labor, oftentimes mediated through contractors. And in all of that kind of, this paper is of course located, looking at a very specific context. So I agree with Amita that, I think this paper was extremely provocative. It was also very interesting for me because, I have done research on worksite housing in the construction sector, but I had taken a very particular lens, which was really trying to understand how both labor governance as well as urban governance regimes, and employers and contractors' practices in the context of those regimes, how they shape worksite housing. And really what that research at the end of it did was a kind of wish list of how, you know, our regulatory frameworks could be changed, etc. But these, we know that, I mean, in practice, kind of reforming some of that is like, there are no easy answers, even in terms of the process required to reform something like that. Both on the labor governance side, as well as labor regulation side, as well as urban governance side. But nonetheless, that was the kind of lens that I have employed in my work in the past by looking at worksite housing. And I think this paper really brought the very important lens of, you know, trying to interrogate worksite housing in the context of, and even, you know, seeing it as a direct outcome of course, suboptimal wages, and then also these terms of employment, which are embedded in extremely uneven power relations between employers, contractors, workers, and then the kind of labor recruitment practices, which, you know, as the paper points out, are, you know, shaped by these practices that kind of go along, organized along lines of caste, region, etc. So I think it gave a very different perspective to me, which has been there at the back of my mind, but I think the articulation of it, to read that was very interesting for me. And I think the paper sort of in pointing out how in these particular on-site arrangements, living arrangements, the ways in which that it kind of, you know, serves employers' purposes to control labor and really control their work and non-work time, their sort of the productive as well as the reproductive lives, and which also determines the relationship with the larger city and the kind of, you know, services that, you know, say local governments offer, or the kind of opportunities that cities can offer in terms of making different kinds of networks and taking those opportunities to better, you know, the kind of work that people can find. But just the fact that these are workers who are confined to living on work sites, and the kind of control and maximizing of surplus extraction that takes place, how that kind of ends up then really, you know, so they're in the city, but they're really not in the city at all. And having no kind of access to whatever possibilities the city may have to offer. So we know that even migrants who don't live at work sites, of course, face immense challenges in accessing what the city has to offer. And yet this is a group of workers, because of on-site accommodation, are even more sort of, you know, further away from being able to access those opportunities, or even having the knowledge of what those kind of opportunities might be. So this was a very interesting lens that, and a very important one that the paper brought to, I think, the research that is picking up on worksite housing. I think there's a lot of scope, and I think certainly worksite housing, I think we are beginning to recognize it through the work that has been done over the last decade. It's still not a lot, and there's a lot of scope, as I said, for further research. But I think we are beginning to recognize worksite housing as a particular typology of housing in our cities, which is not some, you know, small scale thing. It's as I said, across different sectors, and it's from the center of cities. So just now, actually, my the apartment building in which I live, it's 30 years old, and what we have is, you know, we are getting our building repaired and renovated, and we have a whole set of workers who are living within the compound, and you know, that the contractor has got. So I live right in the center of Ahmedabad, and so from that to places like Narol and Vatva, right? So across different sectors, the kind of spaces that worksite housing or on-site living really is spread across is very diverse, and it's by no means a small proportion of the housing in our cities. We have no sense of what that scale would be, like how many workers in our cities actually live in these kind of arrangements on a temporary basis, or even for sometimes longer periods of time. So I think as a category of research, of housing research, I think this is something that needs to be paid more attention, and it's something that we will also have to really engage with the questions around labor much more directly, given that these are arrangements that are happening on work sites. One of the questions that, to sort of turn into a little bit, I think my interest, given now what, I am involved in with Aajeevika Bureau, through the new company that, Aajeevika is incubating, Shelter Square Foundation. I think for me, there is this question, I think Amita already said a lot about, what kind of questions it raises in terms of where do we go from here, right? What are those different paths that we can walk on to try and explore the possibilities of doing something about the kind of extreme marginalization and vulnerability that this kind of housing results in. And so I'd like to kind of, I was trying to think a little bit about that. And so I think a few comments, I wanted to share a few sort of thoughts about that. I think one is that I was kind of trying to grapple partly with this question of whether worksite housing, is the category of worksite housing the same as employer provided housing? We've seen employer provided housing as there's a longer history to that. So if we think about, some of the larger industrial townships and, the kind of worker housing that employers or institutions or big industries provided, is that is obviously not the same as worksite housing, and it's definitely not the same as the kind of on-site housing that we saw in this paper. And yet there is, I think, there might be some value to kind of thinking a little bit about that, because one of the things that I was kind of thinking about was that this is very much, on the work site or right next to it in some vacant land that the factory perhaps doesn't own, but that, it is just a kind of contractors building some hutments on it, etc. So for all purposes, in a sense, it is on the work site, even though it might be next to it. But employer provided housing kind of, if we think of it as a category, then it doesn't spatially, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is housing that is on the work site. And I was kind of, and yet we are saying that, the employers, whether these are the principal employer as they're called in our labor legislation, or whether these are the contractors who are mediating relations of employers with workers, that nonetheless, housing may not be on the work site, but there is clearly, I think, we see a role for employers, a role and responsibility for employers in housing for workers. And across, again, different kind of sectors, what that would mean would obviously be different. So, I'm talking in a much more abstract sort of sense. And I don't want to get into, the more nuanced aspects of it, because then that would take us into different sectors. But if we were to, the moment we think about sort of employer provided housing, which may or may not be on the work site, I think there is some value in holding on to the question of what the responsibility and role of the employer is. But at the same time, kind of thinking about what it would mean for employers to provide housing or be involved, have a role and responsibility in providing housing, which is not just adequate or, livable, or, in the case of the kind of industries that this paper covers, it's not even it's not about then living within the hazardous work site. So it is creating kind of, more safe, livable spaces to live. But the question of whether employer provided housing in today's in today's day and age, given the kind of way in which employment has been changing, is there a possibility of such housing actually resulting in less control over workers as well? Or is it that employer provided housing is always going to be equated with a lot of labor control, surveillance, maximizing the use of labor across any time for any work, etc., and therefore that extreme exploitation? Or is there still a possibility of imagining employer provided housing where there is that possibility of that housing being a space of social reproduction, which renews workers, which regenerates them, which becomes a space of community living, which becomes a space of more freedoms. So maybe all unfreedoms don't go away, but there are more freedoms. And what would that kind of employer-provided housing entail? So I just wanted to put that out there as a question. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it is something I think that we at Aajeevika and Shelter Square will be grappling in the years to come, because we do intend to engage with employers, whether this is in the construction sector, whether this is in factories, including the kind of factories like where boiler workers live. And so what would that entail to not just make housing into something that is more adequate and livable, because that might be a little bit of an easier perhaps intervention in some respects, that you can provide more toilets, perhaps you can make better flooring, you can make better roofing, which currently if they're living in metal corrugated sheet hutments, you can make better roofing that somehow makes it less, gives more thermal comfort. But if these exploitative relationships of work come along with that kind of housing, then what does it mean to continue to look at that as a space of housing intervention? And so I think that is something I wanted to put out there. And the other second question, and then I want to end here, is the question of the role of the state. And I think in that context, from a couple of different angles, I think this question of, which also takes us to the question of advocacy and activism, which is that from whether it is the kind of industrial workshops that were covered in this paper, or whether it is the kind of construction sites where I have done research, including construction sites of very large developers. The question of land, I think, is something that land for housing, right, is something that I think we need to really put back on top of the agenda. So whether this is employer provided housing or whether this is housing that is, being constructed through government schemes, or whether it is hopefully down the line through maybe even other entities like ours. But the question of land and the role of the state in relation to making land available for social housing, employer provided housing, I think that is something we need to start to really think about, because I think that will continue otherwise to remain a big sort of obstacle in whatever we try to do. So I wanted to just kind of end with that, and then maybe if there are other questions, we can again touch upon some of this. Thanks.
You're on mute, Renu. Yeah, your work on the construction workers really was quite inspiring to us. In fact, that perhaps is the only work we could lay our hands on in terms of which really talks about on-site housing and a very detailed sort of an examination of that. I would actually give Shubham to respond to some of these queries, but I thought if I can really address those two questions that you have have posed. One is this employer-provided housing versus worksite housing. I think the real sort of dilemma here is that they are not even employers. We are not even talking to an employee in that sense. So there is, because we are talking about informal worker within this factories. And many of these factories are also kind of quasi-formal enterprises, I would say. If you really go by the legality of an enterprise, kind of an entity, maybe they may not perhaps even. So I think that invisibilization of an army of workers, allows them to really do, and the absence of a very clear accountable relationship between the worker and the employer, and that exactly is the crux of the matter, and that's exactly what really gives them the power to kind of get into practice of this nature, this including many other kind of control mechanisms. So but employer provided housing has a much larger sort of a connotation, as we understand, like even the university teachers living within the university campus is essentially living in employer provided houses, or the earlier kind of Charles and Charlie's in Ahmedabad, provided by the mill owners, may have lacked a lot of other facilities, but there was some sort of a space for the workers to kind of stay and sort of carry out their kind of daily reproduction. So I think those relationships have been significantly sort of toned down, is what the kind of major crisis that we see, and that crisis came from this kind of fragmentation of production and the very nature in which India's MSME sector has been really growing very horizontally rather than vertically. These enterprises have been really kind of fragmenting themselves rather than sort of growing vertically, to kind of, because they know that this is much better than that in terms of kind of being away from regulatory mechanisms, working invisibly from the government control and things like that. So there's a if we really start using the political economy lens, and we can talk about the nexus between the boiler operator and the factories in Ahmedabad, which really, and maybe the kind of kind of violation of boiler kind of rules in the country. And I think the government is also saying that we don't want any more boiler laws now. So I think they are going to repeal those kinds of things. So I think the breakdown of some of those regulatory sort of oversight mechanisms and the legal sort of gaps within which legal regulatory kind of gap within which these organizations, these enterprises work, all that really complicates and kind of help this kind of an arrangement to really thrive. So the government sees it, but it doesn't want to see it, or it can always say that we don't see it because there is no formality between. So I think you really, it is wonderful that you have raised that question, because those are some of these much more complex sort of realities that we need to really now grapple with. Then how are we going to negotiate this fairly sort of difficult sort of path? So I think that is something which that bothers us too. And yeah, I think land is a fair, and we also, I think Shubham would be, or in somebody else also would be able to in kind of tell us that how the land owning kind of communities and groups are able to kind of control worker housing and the quality of worker housing, and how they're able to kind of control the city's peripheries, and through that they can sort of kind of control the labor management or labor governance kind of arrangements, which they can help these kinds of employers to sort of perpetuate this kind of an arrangement. So that's definitely and of course a city like Ahmedabad, I think the lands are like gold. I think the real estate is just kind of is extremely happy to have all of them, rather than sort of allowing factories or workers to claim any part of it. So I think this really, as we have been saying, that it's an absolutely complicated, multidimensional sort of kind of a problem. But we are happy that a small paper with 6 case studies have been able to kind of been able to throw some of these questions up for discussion, and maybe some of us can sort of pick up some of these things. Thanks so much for that wonderful intervention. And I think now we would like Shubham, would you like to come in for a while, or you'll come at a later stage?
Yeah, I think I can come in at a later stage. We can
After getting the questions too, isn't it? Yeah. So yeah, we would like to ideally open the kind of flow for discussion, but we also noticed that Mukta Naik of kind of CPR is attending the kind of the webinar, and she's someone with fairly large body of work and interest in this area. We would like to know whether Mukta would like to make an intervention, ask a question, or say something about the discussion. I hope she's around.
Maybe she has exited, but Amita ma'am has her hand up.
Oh yeah, yes.
I just had a very small intervention, and again, something which was in response to Renu. I think very, very important questions there. But one of the things I think in response to, and Tara, you have already taken those reflections ahead. Okay. But I'm wondering whether the beginning can be made with thinking about some, should one say, floor conditions, okay, about which there can be non-negotiables. For example, the safety of workers to begin with. I think 2 years ago in 4 years ago, sorry, in Mumbai, there was this very famous case of where a few bakery workers who were sleeping on the stairs of a bakery, working in the bakery, they were pummeled by a car belonging to a very famous film actor. Okay? And within this case, the key arguments were in terms of how does one lay the blame on the workers who were sleeping on the pavements. Okay? The employers and the employment question never even entered the entire debate at all. Okay? And this, I think, rightfully raises and links to the points that you were making about the nature of the employment, the nature of the employer, the scale of the employer. Okay? But very practically speaking, there have been a few cases, at least in Maharashtra, where in case of MSME industries and linked to the environmental issues, there has been the solution of common effluent treatment plants, for example. Okay? So I'm wondering whether one could begin to think of some cooperative solutions. By cooperative, I don't mean the formal legal cooperative kind of a sense, but where state agencies in terms of giving land, employers, associations, because definitely they do have their employer, even though they may be small employers, their associations, or I think just building an association of them and the employees. One could think of more decent housing beginning with that. So that's all.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Any questions? Yes, I can see the hand of Harish Shetty.
Yeah, hi. This is Harish, and I'm sorry for keeping the video off. I just shifted the house and it's mess all around. So I'm a research, I'm a PhD research student at University of Bath. And, like Renu knows me because I have taken her help to find, different initiatives on accommodations of migrant workers, because it's really difficult to see the papers and the reports on that. And what you have done is a wonderful job, because I have really found it difficult to find the initiatives on housing and the research studies as well. So my work is about, I'm looking at how migrant construction workers who live on site move from one site to other, and then how they navigate that space. And I'm looking at the agency aspect, like within that limited resources and opportunities, how do they find a safe home in the city, and what negotiations they do with their employers, co-workers, and because now I finished my 6 months ethnography and in the stage of data analysis, so I find how do they also engage with the community and neighborhood. So So I'm asking a similar question here, where you have really highlighted the precarious and how the surplus labor is, like extracted from the workers. Do you also see how do they exercise the agency in terms of try to circumvent these different labor control mechanisms? And if you have documented those, I'd like it would be really happy to hear that.
Shubham, there will be the cases from the garment sector, etc., and the cases where how workers use their, agency, whichever way, isn't it? Shubham should be able to, yeah.
I think that's very interesting. One of the points of the paper was also to, point out that it's not a binary where workers are under, say, such oppressive conditions that they cannot the whole point is that workers also see this modality itself as something that furthers them, their aspirations of, say, being in the city or being able to maximize profit so that they can invest that earning that they are making here back in their homes. So, and we've also seen a lot of we've also seen some, although this is rare, but we've also seen workers who are able to transition from, say, being helpers to contractors. Or say labor contractors, and they're able, and this happens because they are operating within this modality itself, and they're able to sort of climb up that ladder. And also say what Tara ma'am was referring to with respect to garment stitching, what we also see on a more routine basis, on a more regular basis, is how workers negotiate cash advances that they need, say, for instance, or how so workers and also employers sort of see themselves as equal in some ways, given the kind of mobility also that, say, workers within a stitching unit might wield. They are able to because employers also find themselves in a very survivalist position where they have to meet those order targets, and they also need those workers to be there to meet them, right? Or if there's an order that needs to be delivered, so employers always need that. So workers are also able to see all these weaknesses for employers, to put it crudely, in very close ways. So so these are, say, some instances.
Thank you, and I'm really looking forward to read the full paper.
Thank you, Harish. Mansi, Mansi.
Hi, it's so nice to be here with everyone. I just want to say a big congratulations to the team for the great paper and such a fascinating discussion as well right now. Just a small question that was provoked also by Renu's great linkage to employer-provided housing. I was just wondering, Tara ma'am and Shubham, in your research, how did you see workers' relationship with the employer change in terms of the housing arrangement, if they were ill or recovering from an injury, or actually had stopped working? I'm just trying to understand that. Is there more negotiation in this arrangement versus what we see in, say, Jamshedpur steel factories or something, where if you're not working for a long period of time, you leave the housing unit provided for you, right? Did you encounter that workers could stay on if they were between jobs, or if there were not enough work orders, or like I said, in terms of illness or injury? Thanks.
Thanks for that question, Mansi. It's very interesting. Something that I couldn't allude to in my presentation. But like, I haven't had the benefit of reading that much on, more formalized setups. But talking about this particular case studies from here, I think what we've seen is firstly, there are two types of injuries that workers experience. Right, one is something more routine in the sense of finger injuries, or something that burns and everything that they deal with, which is considered part of the job itself. And to a certain extent, workers are required to cope with it on their own, come up with their own mechanisms. But also when it comes to illnesses, or we've also seen how sometimes employers are, they do step in to take care of the workers as well. Or they do, provide for, take them to a private clinic. And if I also recall from some of my interactions, I think workers also alluded to how although they might not be paid for that period when they're taking a break, they are allowed to rest within the same unit. And they also find ways to be able to, reclaim that amount of work that they might have missed. So say if they have their own target that, we need to earn so much money within a month because we have to provide, say, we have to repay a loan or something. So these are very subjective examples, but yeah, these are some of the very, some instances, subjective instances that I came across while doing my collection. I hope that answers your question, and maybe in detail I can tell you more later.
No, it's very interesting, as you said, that their work in a way waits for them, so they can catch up, which adds to another dimension of the freedom unfreedom debate, right? So thanks.
Ma'am, you're on mute.
I think there's a comment on the chat box by Aravind Murthy ji, which tells us that, the researchers should also take account of the current political sort of, realities of, unionization, unions, etc. into future sort of studies. I think we definitely kind of take that. Yeah. Other questions, please?
I have a question actually to Amita.
Yes,
Ma'am, are there any examples from maybe your efforts or the efforts of others in terms of advocacy, especially in Mumbai, especially related to these peri-urban areas where the urban governance mechanisms are not clear at all? Theoretically, Labour Department does have a, like an oversight mandate in some of these areas, but the provisioning for public kind of amenities, water, sanitation, especially for migrant workers who occupy these industrial kind of clusters, which are outside the ambit of maybe the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation. That's not clear at all for us in Ahmedabad. Like who is the advocacy audience here? Who do we advocate to? Who is, even on the books, who is theoretically sort of accountable or responsible for all of this? So are there any lessons from Mumbai with regard to these questions?
Very, very difficult. No, none. See, because it's areas which are outside the municipal corporation cannot be legally held responsible also. But actually, what is very interesting is the Gram Panchayat Acts. And if these are Gram Panchayats in which this Gram Panchayats make no distinction and they do not talk about encroachments, etc., at all. In fact, which is why there are a lot of perhaps many of these liminal spaces in Gram Panchayat areas. And in the past, I know that in the history of Mumbai, Gram Panchayats have been extremely progressive when it comes to provision of basic services. For example, Mrunal Gure, one of the great socialist leaders who passed away, she was, I think, a Gram Panchayat president for Goregaon Gram Panchayat. Goregaon, which was at one point in time outside the Mumbai Municipal Corporation limits. But they ensured that all basic services were provided to, they didn't even call them slums, or they did not call them unauthorized. So everything that is within the Gram Panchayat limits, one could provide services to. Okay, so there can be like these kind of, I would say, roundabout routes that one can definitely take. To provide. Okay.
Nancy, you have another question?
Yeah, only if we have time.
Yes, we have maybe.
Yeah. It's just a very broad question because Amita ma'am and Renu ma'am are here on housing, of how the Pagri system works in terms of industrial spaces, because it has been studied for property ownership, but when I was doing some research also with Aajeevika some years ago, we heard a lot about the compound, the entire industrial compound being under Pagri. So it would be great to know if you knew a bit more about if there was any difference in terms of Pagri paperwork for industrial or residential use.
So Renu can respond to this. I am really not aware, because to me, Pagri system itself is beyond the law. There is no legal recognition for a Pagri system. Okay, so.
Okay.
No, I was actually going to say that maybe Amita can say something about this. Because I don't think we know enough about, in what way. Yeah.
So, yeah. If there are no further questions, we are, it's going to be, it's about 5:45 now. We could perhaps kind of call it a day. Thank you so much for, all the three discussants, Professor Lerche, Professor Bhide, and Professor Desai. I think it was, it was a little adventurous for us to kind of put one paper for kind of discussion. But still, I think, like our idea was that we would be able to kind of, bring attention to the larger phenomenon of housing for workers, etc. But I think you have been so generous in terms of kind of offering very, very important, interesting comments to us. That's also encouragement for our young researchers to carry forward, their research endeavors in future. Thanks so much, on behalf of Work Fair and Free Foundation, we must really sort of, express our great sort of sincere gratitude to all the three of you and all of the participants who sort of, sat through the webinar. And of course, the time is very limited. We would have really loved to go on, kind of bring in more questions, etc. And please join us for our sort of future seminars and webinars too. Divya, would you like to kind of formally close it?
No, it's fine. I just, want to again thank everyone for a wonderful discussion. Like Renu pointed out, I also think that, just being able to highlight worksite housing as a distinct typology of, housing arrangement for migrant workers in cities is something we wanted to kind of do through this paper. And it's something we've observed on the ground with years of community engagement and being able to kind of, academically project this with evidence as a very distinct housing arrangement for workers in cities, especially to point it out to the state that this is something that needs, policies around and regulation to take note of, this invisibilization that's so pervasive across sectors, across India, especially now in the urban peripheries, where again, like we discussed, the governance is so complicated because our rural panchayats are responsible for these areas, our municipal corporation is responsible, our employers are responsible. So it just results in passing the baton from one stakeholder to the other, and activists and practitioners like us are also not able to really hold any one stakeholder accountable for the welfare and dignity of workers in these areas. So I think that was our sort of main purpose and motivation behind initiating this inquiry. And we are really happy that so many of you attended, and it was a great discussion. So thank you again.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to Shubham. Thanks to
I wanted to say
Fair and Free.
exactly. No, I think
And thanks for putting us all together. Great to see you, Renu.
Yes, same here.
Shubham deserves a thanks too. Thank you,
Yes,
Shubham.
I wanted to say that Shubham, great job, because we know that one of the things is that, just accessing these kind of spaces and workers living in these spaces to understand these kind of arrangements, it's so challenging. And I think the kind of findings, the kind of things that you've been able to bring out from your interviews and observations, despite there being such a small sample, actually it is very rich. So wanted to say thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone for the comments.
Mm.